Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's CECAN webinar. My name is Lisa Fletcher, and I'm one of the 3 part-time CECAN Centre Managers. For those of you who are new to our CECAN webinars, CECAN stands for the Centre for the Evaluation of Complexity Across the Nexus. For the past 3 years, we have been transforming the practice of policy evaluation across the food, energy, water, and environmental domains to make it fit for a complex world. We have achieved this through pioneering, testing, and promoting innovative policy evaluation approaches with UK government departments. To find out more about our work, please visit our website www.cecan.ac.uk. Today's webinar is about group concept mapping, and we are delighted to have Mary Kane, the Principal Consultant of Concept Mapping of Concept Systems, live from New York, and also Professor Brian Castellani, Professor of Sociology at the University of Durham. Brian is also a key member of our CECAN research team. Mary's going to speak to us for around 45 minutes, and then we'll have some time for your questions at the end. Please submit your questions at any point via the question box, which you should be able to see on the Zoom webinar control panel. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our CECAN website along with Mary's presentation. I will now hand you over to Mary and Brian for the presentation.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning from here. And I love the concept of being live from New York. I feel as if I'm on Saturday Night Live. So thank you for that, Lisa. It's a real pleasure to have been invited. And I just thought I might spend a moment telling you a little bit about how I got here and why I am happy to be here. And then I will explain the title of my talk. The reason why I'm here is because I had the opportunity to meet Emma Uprichard at a conference in Dublin last year, and we began talking about how one thinks about the knowledge that is required to consider complexity in context, especially the ones that CECAN concentrates on in order to do policy change in a very complex environment. And we'll talk more about how we reach down and through systems to get to the point of knowledge that will help us do that. The title that I've chosen, which is extremely long, you know, I have this tendency to be verbal, is co-creation of innovation. And co-creation is a really deliberate choice of words here. Group concept mapping is a process and method that we use in my work. And the key component about group concept mapping is that it permits and actually encourages the surfacing of values of the more knowledgeable others in authoring elements around complex systems and decision strategies to address change. So it's a really critical way of our thinking about the combination of where the value is placed in an organization and how we get at it. I'm really happy to be here today, and I want to thank you all for welcoming me. These are some of the things that I've been thinking about a little bit. I've been thinking about how we build group complexity without complicating things so that the emphasis is on the establishment and the articulation of complexity without the burden of complication, which is the organizational tendency. We want to think about, and what I've been thinking about lately is what the linkages are between individual knowledge, individual perspectives, opinions, experiences, and the establishment or the creation of what we call group wisdom. And group wisdom, as you all probably know, is not a new term, but it is a term that now has greater capacity to help change things because we now have a way to quantify that as opposed to using primarily group participation to surface that. I've been thinking a lot about ways that evaluation can be anchored in systems that value the concept of the more knowledgeable other. And we'll be talking more about that today. And then I'd like to just share with you just a few minutes on the groupwisdom.tech technology that I own and that is fundamental to the work that we do here at Concept Systems. The learning outcomes that we talked about when I began to be involved with CECAN were some of these. We want to think about the concept of valuing voice and the relevance of the short term MKO, which stands for more knowledgeable other, in complexity and in evaluation. And of course, the question is, if we're thinking about evaluation, then the precursor to evaluation is utilization. And so we want to make sure that we're thinking about these things as a system of thinking, implementation, utilization, and evaluation as key components that the more knowledgeable other can inform. I want to share with you a little bit about the foundations and applications of group concept management to you, because they may have relevance for some of the work that you may be interested in, specifically around evaluation systems. And then we're going to be looking a little bit at experiences and initiatives that are relevant to the mission of CECAN. And I've chosen 3 examples of projects that we've been involved in, and they are at very different levels, organizationally speaking. And I hope they're illustrative of the way that group wisdom or group concept mapping as a method can apply in contexts that are far-ranging, complex, and often discordant or disconnected. And so the key component is, how can group concept mapping help overcome some of those barriers to policy change, to progress, and to innovation? And then I'm going to show you a couple of snapshots of the group wisdom tool itself. One of the things that I am most interested in these days is this concept of how decisions are made as a group. How are decisions made as a community or a society? Are there differences, whether the group is a business or whether it's a community? And who decides how group decisions are made and in what context? The context that I'm really most interested in is this concept of raising from the base, typically people who are not often asked about issues that affect them, the knowledge or the opinions or the perspectives that are critical to a decision strategy. By the way, you'll see as we go through our discussion today that I spend a lot of time asking questions. And then sometimes I suggest some ways of thinking about answers to those questions, but that doesn't mean that I'm providing all the answers there are, or that I would be the sort of the voice of authority on all of these things. It's really, in essence, to help us think together and to explore these concepts together. So you'll see this happening more and more frequently as we go forward with this discussion today. So when we think about this concept of valuing voice and more knowledgeable other, what does that mean to a decision? And what does that mean to the value or the quality of the decision? And then when we think about who decides how group decisions are made, that is really a key question. So I'm going to show you a couple of models that are, as you will see immediately, very, very simple and quite flawed. So we see here the organizational pyramid of decision making, and this can take place in a not-for-profit or NGO structure. It can take place in government or business or academic constructs. So a first way of looking at decision making is what is termed, I think ironically, the rational model. And in this instance, people talk about the rational model being informed by the circumstances, objective, and I have that in italics because it's a questionable term when it comes to this sort of decision strategy, selection of an optimal choice from appropriate alternatives. So the locus of control of the rational model is, as you can see, rooted in the C-suite or in the provost and dean level of decision making, or the executive level. The administrative model is different from that, and is typically centered at the management level, where you may have decisions around programs or strategy that have to make choices among realistic options. And in a lot of cases, there's sort of a concept of horse trading that takes place here. It's necessary at this point to reconcile values of various subgroups or various offices before a decision can be made. It typically rests at the manager level. And then there is the political model, or what is called the political model. And this is where people, organizations, multiple leaders, multiple managers come together in committee to negotiate a set of non-ideal solutions. So in my view, none of these are ideal, but that's the nature of emergent and dynamic processes around decision making. The political model has the danger of being the kind of the designing an elephant by committee, when everybody just sees portions of the animal that they hope to create. So what's missing in this picture? In our view, from an emergent point of view, we consider a key component to be the members of the construct, the members of the environment, or the members of the organization. And by members, we mean whoever is at the level of acting, doing, knowing, needing, and performing the things that are required, or the things that make up the essence of the organization. In this instance, we consider that the assets of any organization or community include its members, so that when we're making decisions about environmental policy, or we're making decisions about health and well-being in a community or in a region, the idea that those decisions can be made through any of the other decision models that are listed here without the involvement of members seems naive, and it seems flawed. So when we think about the more knowledgeable other, which is a concept that is rooted in work that was done by a Russian social scientist in the 30s, we're thinking now about this was really in the academic setting, or the learning setting, I should say, in the school setting. The definition of more knowledgeable other is anyone who has a better understanding or a higher ability level than the learner, and in this instance, everybody's a learner, with respect to a particular thing, a task, a process, a concept. The MKO is normally thought of as a teacher or a coach or an older adult, so that tracks to sort of the hierarchical model we just looked at. But the MKO can also be peers, or someone younger with different experiences, with computers or other kinds of knowledge bases that can inform decisions that need to be enriched by knowledge that the hierarchical construct of decision strategies doesn't include or doesn't have access to. So this is, as I mentioned before, from cognitive development and learning theory of the early 30s, which was then resuscitated in the 60s, which I thought was interesting. The MKO is really a key component in social interaction, because the MKO is the knowledge holder. And the MKO, or the more knowledgeable other, may have a unique set of knowledge. So we would hope and expect, actually, that there would be a confluence of more knowledgeable others, each contributing a specific unit of knowledge that doesn't exist elsewhere, or confirming units of knowledge that do exist elsewhere, to help strengthen the concepts and strengthen the capacity to act upon those constructs. A key component of the more knowledgeable other is that learning is a reciprocal experience between the knowledge holder and the knowledge receiver. And the knowledge holder may be person A and the knowledge receiver person B in a particular discussion, and those roles may be flipped when discussing something else, because each and every individual has knowledge that someone else does not have completely or fully, or can contribute to a knowledge base in a dynamic way. So it changes the dynamic of insight development and idea networking to achieve a higher order perspective without losing the details of the knowledge of the individual. So the best model is a confluence of more knowledgeable others who are each contributing from different perspectives. It's as if people are looking through a prism, and they're looking through one of the facets of the prism, seeing the same things, but seeing things perhaps slightly differently. And when we step back, we can see the entire thing. As I mentioned before, the more knowledgeable other was introduced more widely in the early 60s. The innovation is that MKO is applied to inform thinking not only about things, about the context themselves or the problems themselves, like environmental change and things like that, but about social action and learning itself. So the more knowledgeable other has become a tool in social science research to allow us to think about the theory of decision making and the theory of informing then a life cycle from decision making to implementation to utilization to evaluation. The more knowledgeable other has a fundamental role in the development of group cognition, and a key component from Vygotsky is that community plays a central role in the process of making meaning. And how do we build community of knowledge? We build it by accessing, encouraging, and embracing the content that individuals in that context know. So who is a more knowledgeable other? Well, just like many things that we talk about here, because we are social science researchers, it depends. So my question for you is, are you an MKO in any of these things? Would you think of yourself as a more knowledgeable other when people are attending a symphony concert, for example? Is there something that you know that others who are attending with you might not know? What about planning a meal for a 3-year-old? Who would be a more knowledgeable other in a context like that? Because it's tricky. Assessing the safety of a building. How would we go about identifying more knowledgeable others when it comes to doing something like that? Planning an impact evaluation. Whom would we go to say, you are a more knowledgeable other than I am in planning an impact evaluation, or to articulate the issues related to impact evaluation at an international level, for example? Or who would be a more knowledgeable other when we're thinking about celebrating a community milestone? So you can see, even with just these examples, it's very different in terms of whom we would involve to help us create a fully informed plan that can then be implemented. So the question that I have for you also is, what do we need to know before we can identify the more knowledgeable others? So if you're thinking about the folks that we're listing here as potentially contributing to the solution that we're looking for, or the results that we're looking for, what do we need to know about the more knowledgeable others, or the circumstances, before we can identify those more knowledgeable others? So what problem are we trying to solve? Who has something to say about that problem? And how can we reach into their knowledge? Or what opportunity do we want to take advantage of? For example, if we are celebrating a community milestone, what might we want to take advantage of that already exists, and who knows about those things? Or what situation calls for change? What situation calls for innovation that has not taken place yet, and that is critical to pivoting the issue from what is to what needs to be? This is where I'd like to introduce group concept mapping as an idea and as a method to get at the very questions we're talking about. So when we think about group concept mapping, we're thinking about valuing voice, and we're thinking about complexity without, as I said before, undue complication. And so when we think about complexity and how we get to it, using the tools that we use, I just want to think about these things in some order with you. So complexity in systems is still difficult to visualize graphically. When we think about, especially at the individual contribution level, it can be very difficult to have a co-constructed visualization of complex issues that are organized in such a way that individuals can understand them at a glance, or individuals can use them to further the issues that they're addressing. That visualization of complexity without overcomplication is still a difficult thing to do, especially at the grassroots or community level. We believe that complexity in organizations is an asset if we take advantage of it. The fact that each more knowledgeable other doesn't know the same thing that another person knows is an asset rather than a deficit when we're trying to build something that doesn't exist yet. Voice is a means of taking advantage of and visualizing the complexity of the group. So if we value the voice of the individuals who are involved in an organization, whether it's a research institute or whether it is a community struggling with public health issues, when we begin to value the voices of those who know things, that changes our ability to visualize complexity so that utilization can take place. In our view, group concept mapping is a really strong tool to capture this complexity and demonstrate it or represent it back to those who authored it. And it allows us then to build a new system of thinking because of who's involved that we didn't have before. Group concept mapping is a method that we use in social science research and in organizational development that seeks and engages and captures the voices of those who are affected by, contributing to, or are expert in a topic of interest or need. So the point is, who needs to be involved in a project is the key component, the driver for group concept mapping. GCM helps us to equalize the knowledge and produces a commonly authored construction on the issue at hand. And that's a key component. Social policy formation, program innovation, strategy development, and evaluation all can come out of group concept mapping. Group concept mapping, as I mentioned, is a way to collect thoughts on a specific question and then use that information. The interesting thing about group concept mapping is that the result is a meaningful two-dimensional map of the ideas and their relationship to each other. Every single idea and its relationship to each other, which has been authored by the more knowledgeable others in the system in order to create a picture of the system itself. It leads to insights and interconnections among the elements so that we can talk about 100 ideas without losing the details. We can talk about the concepts that are captured in higher level ideas as well, and we can then begin to think about how we implement what's going on. So who are the more knowledgeable others and what do we ask of them? I'm going to share with you just a couple of examples of work that we have done that are at very different levels in the organizations, and to tell you a little bit about whom we asked, I'm sorry. So in the National Cancer Institute in the US here, we were trying to develop comprehensive cancer control plans that would assist in the development of an evaluation system that would be nationwide relative to comprehensive cancer control and prevention. So the initial people that we asked to help us understand the issues around cancer control were researchers, practitioners, and funders of research. The next level that we were involved in were asking the people who work in the states and regions to help us articulate from their perspective the priority issues relative to prevention in particular. So we looked at both sides of the coin, the cancer control, which is the research side, and prevention, which is often a public health issue. In the state of New York, we conducted a project with individuals, young people who have disabilities ranging from social and mental behavioral disabilities to physical disabilities and learning disabilities. And the question really was, how do we help transition these young people from the context in which they are sheltered somewhat to a transition to adulthood? And so we involved caregivers, family members, program leads, state agencies, and in some instances, we conducted focus groups with the children themselves. In the state of Delaware, the Behavioral Health Consortium accessed people who are suffering right now from substance use disorders and their families. We involved corrections and justice systems, schools, state agencies, advocates, and policy people. So what our intention was to hear from the voices of all of these more knowledgeable others to create a construct that everyone could see their perspectives in, and agreement to act could emerge. So MKOs can be leaders, they can be committee members, they can be representatives of a particular set of concerns or interests. They can be anyone who has a stake in the issue. And so it's important for the researcher to determine that, to make that determination. So what do we ask of these people? We ask them three things. First, we ask, what do you know, think, perceive, believe, observe, understand about the particular question at hand? Then the key component about group concept mapping is that we ask them this question: how do you think individually all of the contributed thoughts, beliefs, sorry, typo, perceptions are related in meaning? What do you individually think about all of these ideas and how they are related in meaning, independent of anyone else's organizing models, independent of any other contributors' ways of looking at these ideas in terms of meaning? And then, what do you value? What do you observe or attribute priority to of all of the contributed ideas, not just your own? So these are the three things that we ask of people in group concept mapping. I want to note here that the person is the unit of interest in group concept mapping. The ideas that are generated are from all members of the community who are invited to take part. And in some instances, we have people like the Lieutenant Governor participating, and we have someone who is a community member who is a peer recovery person, for example, for someone who needs help. All of these people produce the product, which identifies and engages the person as the unit of interest, the more knowledgeable other. And that is why we call it valuing voice, because it's critical to communicate that valuing of voice to the people who are involved. So the three things we ask are, what do you know, think, perceive, believe? How do you think about these things, and what do you value? And how we get at these things are brainstorming, whatever that means in the context. And it can mean things like conducting interviews or doing appreciative inquiry or conducting community forums or focus groups where we pose a question and then we ask people to respond to that question. Or we can do, typical traditional brainstorming, either live or on the web. How we capture people about their own contributed thoughts and beliefs and how they organize them is that we conduct individual open sorting by each person. Each participant conducts an individual open sort on all of the ideas that have been captured. And then we conduct an analysis in group wisdom that takes the qualitative data we've produced and processes it, adds quantitative data in order to align the meaning sorts of every person together. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. And then what do you value, observe, or attribute priority to? At this point, then, after we've conducted the sorting with individuals, they then can provide for us ratings on each item, each of the, let's say, 100 ideas that came out of the brainstorming. And they rate on something like importance, level of need, feasibility to address, level of present evidence, any rateable question that is important. And here is really where the constructs and the capacity of group wisdom is different from other approaches to doing the similar things. Group concept mapping produces maps that organize and visualize complexity, as I mentioned. We use simple processes. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples now about work that we have done in very different fields. And here is the focused prompt. We use typically one question to be the engine, the catalyst for the idea generation. And in this instance, the question we asked was, what is a specific thing we can do to deal with the issues we are facing in our state's behavioral health, including mental health related issues and addiction? It's that clear. We asked in this instance an action question. Sometimes we ask issue questions. Sometimes we ask contextual sort of theory development question that can help us inform the environment in which we're working. Sometimes we can ask an evaluative question. But in this case, we're asking, what is it we can do? And we were deliberate about the voice being first person plural to make sure that we were translating that concept. In this map, this is a concept map. It might be the first one you've ever seen in your life. The concept map consists of 117 specific ideas. Each of them has a number associated with it. That number is simply an identifying number, in this case from 1 to 117. And those ideas are the building blocks for action. In this map, when we conduct the analysis, the two-dimensional array of ideas spreads across an area like this, and the meaning is how close two ideas are in space means that they were thought to be, when all of the sorting was aggregated across all sorters, they were thought to be more similar in meaning than the other ideas on the map. We hope, when we work through this, we hope that this is a saturation of the topic at hand from multiple perspectives, organized in a way to visualize the complexity, but allow access to the content so that decisions can be made clearly. We also then do a cluster analysis, and we produced here an 11 conceptual array structure to allow us to look at that. And when we take off the points, we now have the outline of our work. We have ideas that all should answer the focus prompt. What can we do and where can we do it? Obviously, children in schools, family safety, work readiness. So these are talking about locus of control of where we can help change things. Then how we change things, legislation and support. With what we change things, resources, treatment, a treatment system, and then how do we translate those changes? By changing perceptions and educating people. And the fundamental thing is in the middle, which is readiness in every community. So when we think about this, we think about it as a system at both this detail level, the individual items, which suggest specific actions, the conceptual level, and then the operational level, where we think about where we do it, what we do, how we do it, and how we communicate it. And this is the way the map allows us to break down the silos of planning and address from everyone's point of view where their perspective is placed in the map and in the context. Here's an example about an evaluation system development, and the focus prompt. This was a project we did with the UN's International Labor Organization. The focus prompt was, what should we consider or include to further define, develop, and apply impact evaluation in the International Labor Organization, which is an important multi-site, very sort of a boots on the ground approach to program development, access, and implementation, and then of course impact evaluation, which is driven by a funding concern, of course, in many instances. So this is a map that describes the items that we wanted to share, and here is the model that emerges out of it. So what do we need to do to define impact evaluation and apply it? And the model then, in our conversations with the client, turned into a sort of a two-tier model where we have context and strategy defined and what knowledge and capacity is needed in-house at ILO to support the development of impact evaluation throughout all their systems. And so this allows us to think structurally about our own sort of social science and evaluation tools. And so we can think about this as a development of a theory of impact evaluation that can then be practiced. So what data produces this kind of map? And I want to just show you a very simple example. When you think about having 103 ideas or 117 ideas or 100 specific concepts on a map, where do we get that data so that we can say with a degree of confidence that the resulting two-dimensional array produces a meaning relationship that organizes complexity and allows us to take action or to understand the context. So I'm going to show you a little example here. Each person contributes to the structure. So let's say that we have a 5-idea item set. We never have a 5-idea item set, obviously, because why would we do group concept mapping? We could just look at the ideas. But this is an example I wanted to show you. So Nancy is to sort these. And okay, I'm sorry, I was distracted for a moment. Nancy is to sort these, and they are about a project which is to be a community-based intervention. So the ideas that people suggested were invite communities with a common need to help create a model, hire an expert, visit cultures that have traditions of decision-making, spread the word in academic circles, and get funding from the UN. So Nancy then needed to figure out how these ideas were related in meaning according to her view of the world. So Nancy sorted the green and the magenta together, the purple and the yellow together, and then she had the blue one by itself. So this is her version of the truth of these 5 ideas. Then John is sorting the same ones. His sort is a bit different. He sorted 3 of the items together and 2 of the items together differently from what Nancy produced. Then Ben sorted the same 5 ideas and sorted them differently from everybody the people who produced the other sorts. And you'll see in Ben's sort, he sorted the magenta one with 2, but he didn't sort them with the 2 that John sorted them with. So then the question becomes, how do we parse these? How do we create a common construct from different views of the same data? So this is what we call complexity in action. For each person with 5 items, there are 120 possible solutions per person. And so the opportunity to create innovation comes from harnessing the knowledge in context from multiple points of view. And for us, our analysis tools need to be ready for all permutations and all people. It's all really context driven, but the tools themselves need to be able to be context driven. So each item has a different meaning relationship to every single other item on the map. So in this case, you'll see that the green one is sorted with magenta, then it's sorted by itself, then it's sorted with magenta and purple. The purple one is sorted with gold, then by itself, and then with magenta and green. So you can imagine the complexity of trying to do this on a wall with sticky notes and do it with any rigor. Group wisdom then is a technology that we own that allows for data communication, data collection, communication with participants, analysis, and results production. It captures the input of all the more knowledgeable others at all those 3 levels that I mentioned: idea generation, organizing the ideas individually to reflect your own perception of the world that these ideas represent, and then the ratings or values. So these are the really critical aspects that we do. Group wisdom is content derived from the more knowledgeable others. The analysis is performed on all sorting arrays from all participants, and this can number, we just did a project that involved 10,000 teenagers, and it was really something. I wouldn't recommend it, but it was really a groundbreaking project. What happens with the analysis then is it produces a truly group-authored conceptual framework for innovation, and it defines complexity and helps us manage it. Group wisdom has an analysis engine that is structured like this. It has we construct a similarity matrix of the ideas for each person's sort. Multidimensional scaling is run upon those the large similarity matrix. We then conduct hierarchical cluster analysis. We conduct anchoring analysis and spanning analysis. These are the multidimensional scaling and hierarchical cluster analysis are very familiar to many people who work in social research and in other kinds of research. Anchoring analysis and spanning analysis are overlays that we've created that allow us to make some judgments about the relationship of ideas and their values to each other. Here's the similarity matrix that we typically use. Again, I'm using a very small example. This is a sort for one person on 10 items. You see that this person sorted 5 and 8 together, then had 4 items together, then 2 more items, and then they had 1 item and 1 item on their own. The binary square similarity matrix shows you in a binary code the sorts and as they exist in this array. This qualitative array above is then translated into a quantitative array upon which we can operate. And so with this binary square similarity matrix, you can see that, 1 is always sorted with 1. That's the nature of that. And then 1 and 2 were sorted together. 1 and 6 were sorted together. 1 and 9 were sorted together. And that is represented by a presence of something. And in this case, it's a 1. And then if you're thinking about 5 participants, this table is a poor illustration of a similarity matrix that produces a summary of 5 participants' data. You can see obviously that number 1 and number 1 was always sorted with each other. So there is a diagonal of 5, which represents the number of participants. Then if you look at the column of 1 and 1 through 10, you can see there's an illustration here that shows that 1 and 2 were sorted once together, 1 and 3 were sorted twice together, 1 and 4 were sorted 4 times together, and so on. So this allows us then to sum up, looking through almost the dimensions of the sorting meaning from each person to each other person. And so the code here is, to what degree do people agree that these ideas are together? And to what degree is there variation in the sorting? And luckily for us, there's often a great deal of variation. So the input to group concept mapping is this relationship array that emerges out of the matrix and produces an n-dimensional mapping of the entities based on the relationship. The n is the number of people who have sorted, and the two-dimensional array that we have here is the distance or the closeness of the ideas based upon the data in the table. As you can imagine, as we add more ideas and more people, there's a greater degree of complexity in the array, but it doesn't get any more complicated, which is good. This is the data that you see. I want to show you a couple of snapshots from Group Wisdom, the technology that we have. And what I'm showing you right now is a cluster map creator. And this banner here is your ability as a researcher to look at the data and how it gloms together in grouping by looking at, let's say, 6 groupings or clusters first, and then you can go up to as many groupings or clusters as you want to see where the content falls into areas of interest that we can call clusters. Just like in this example, you can visually make some distinctions around, let's say, 4 groupings or clusters that might work for you. There may be other interpretations when you know the content. So that's an interesting way for us to think about. Visually, this would make sense together. Perhaps what we need is to look at this as a cluster and this as a cluster alone. And that happens in the interpretation that we work through. Producing the co-authored conceptual map is also done out of the technology. So this is a picture that's produced in a project that we're currently active in around human resource technology and efficiencies to capture the processes that a large university, in this case Cornell, use in order to make decisions about hiring and onboarding individuals. The key component here is that they are really interested in using this to evaluate processes as well. And also in group concept mapping, we use the values to produce what we call pattern matches, which array at the cluster level opinions on value, in this case importance, from one group to another group to another group, and we can see some distinctions and commonalities among the group at a glance. So again, illustrating complexity, but in a way that is completely accessible to those who need to make decisions with it. Similarly, this is what we call a go zone, and the go zone is something that produces within each group or cluster. So this is screening and interviews, and the go zone produces an example of what's important to one group of people and what's important to another group of people, where they agree in this scatter plot, and where they agree. So this is high agreement on importance, so they both agree on these. This is high agreement on less importance, and then these are actually gap zones, which are areas where one group of people thought something was slightly more important than the other group. So what does this mean to co-creation of innovation? And I realize I think I have about 2 more minutes. The key component for us as innovators and as systems thinkers are that the results are co-constructed by everyone who participated. The act of participation produces conscious contribution to innovation. And I want to just draw our attention to that concept. We're used to collecting data, but we all often are not connecting the data to the collecting opportunity or to the participation opportunity. So the act itself, that process, allows for conscious contribution to innovation. The results really combine clear qualitative data development with rigorous quantitative approaches to get at what I've been showing you, and the approach is responsive and adaptable to context. The question you ask is driven by the context. The people you ask to be participating is also driven by the context. So how does this approach align with systematic evaluation? First of all, as I said before, it's complex, it's not complicated. It describes emergent systems for planning and evaluation across the nexus or within a subsystem of the nexus or the system. It supports agile research on the ground or in the academy, and it integrates perceptions of experts with those who have lived experience within a system without a barrier that typically can be present. It helps us to think about appreciative inquiry at all levels. So now it's your turn to ask me questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Mary. I'm hoping everybody can hear me okay. This is Brian Castellani, stepping in to do some Q&A. As we go along, if people can post their questions in the chat, and then I will move those questions along to Mary in the next 10 or 15 minutes that we have left. One of the first questions, Mary, that's asked is, could you tell a little bit more about how the individual concept clusters are actually named? I mean, you sort of spoke to that at the end, but maybe a bit more on that.
Yes, thank you for the question. I kind of skipped that piece. The cluster groupings are named starting with data that the participants themselves provide. So each person who produces a sort names the groupings or clusters that they create in their own sorting array. So they essentially articulate and identify their sort of perceptual frame by naming the clusters in their own work. We take that information, and when we produce the map that we think is a good fit for the data, we then access the data that includes the names of clusters that people produce themselves that have a lot of similarity with the final result. And we look at the list of the top 10 cluster names that the individuals contributed when they did the process. And we look at those to see how we can kind of respect and use the data that people provided in that way, and then adjust it if needed to actually reflect the content. But that's a great question. Thank you.
Relative to that, have you ever had the experience? I use cluster analysis a lot in my own work, and I know CECAN, we use it a bit for these sorts of things. Have you found where you need to go back and rethink the names of clusters based on walking through this process, or perhaps increasing the number of clusters or decreasing them,
yes,
you know, to sort of better fit the way people are thinking?
Yes, and in our process, Brian, we conduct, you know, it's our responsibility as the researchers to get the data as close to a good fit as possible. But then the last word is really the organization or the client or the community who can then tell us if we got it right. And so when we go back to the community or the organization or the committee, these are the very questions we ask. Does this array of clusters answer your need? And if not, how can we rethink some of the clusters, perhaps break them out, or in some instances even combine them because they might be too granular for their need. And then similarly, when we talk about the conceptual cluster names, that's a key component of what we do at that point. And we actually have an exercise that helps people to articulate from the ground up, from the stuff inside each cluster, the content, so that we can make sure that we get the cluster names correct, so that they are, so that they have stamina, so that they can be used over a period of time.
Relative to that, this next question is a nice segue right into what I was wondering myself is, so how do you, the question here is, how do you manage for misinterpretations, right? So you have intended meanings between, say, the original person or group of individuals posing an idea and then someone else, because you had, you know, you talked about the similarity matrix and then looking at this from an n-dimensional perspective, but how do you actually deal with that potential that people are misrepresenting or misthinking or misunderstanding?
So your question is that, if I'm hearing you correctly, that someone contributes an idea that then might be misinterpreted by someone, and that affects the way the person number two sorts it?
Yeah, I think so. You know, if, say, someone's in human resources and someone's in, say, purchasing, and yet someone's over here in research and grants, you know, misunderstanding what they're actually talking about when we're talking about the system.
That's a really good point. And so one of the things that we try very hard to do is to provide instructions for people that describe trying to be as clear as possible, trying to have one specific idea in each contribution, one of the things that happens most often, and it won't surprise you that it happens in academia, is that people pile on. So that when we do work in academic institutions, we often, in the past, we've actually gotten statements for a question around a departmental or university strategy that people actually write a paragraph and then they cite themselves as a resource. So our job then is to parse that and look at the elements that are the most clearly stated way of saying that thing that people are saying. And the other thing is that we have to trust ambiguity and trust the context and the people in it. So it's a real combination of giving them good data to work on, but also then to say, in the context, these are people who understand and know the context very well. And if there are misfires, and this happens sometimes where people sort things in different places where you wouldn't expect them to be sorted, is it interpretable? Does it support or make sense in the context that it ends up? This is why, and I kind of glossed over the anchoring and bridging and the spanning analysis that we produce. And that is the anchoring and bridging analysis is an analysis that we produce on every item and every cluster of items to show the strength of location of the ideas on the map based upon the sorts. Because often what happens is if there's ambiguity in a statement, some people will sort it with one group of ideas and some people will sort it with another group of ideas. And that idea itself becomes a bridging item between those clusters. Bridging items are not necessarily negative, but they are something that then requires some contextual interpretation in order for people to feel confident that it's usable where it is. Anchoring is the other side of that, and that is we look at the data around those items that are clearly the coalescing items in a group or an area of ideas. And that helps us to sort of define that territory more clearly. So that's a long answer to your question.
No, that's fantastic. And actually the next question that's been asked sort of leads out of that. So that's on, so we sort of have one question, is the machinery and how it's arriving at, an optimal answer, then concerns about how the participants, this question goes to the opposite side, which is sort of, I think myself coming from a psychometric background as well, as the sort of ultimate question is, because the prompt is so crucial for getting useful data.
Yes.
Do you have any additional resources or recommendations for developing the focus prompt? This individual went on to say, I like the different categories of questions you presented. Are there additional examples of those types of questions anywhere, and what types of responses they elicit?
Yes, the answer is yes. We have an enormous amount of background resources here, and tools that we make available to people to do the kind of work that we're talking about. We've been around for 25, almost 26 years now, and we have been working with a huge range of organizations. Our website has publications, hundreds of publications that either we or other people have written in fields sort of across the spectrum. Some of the publications are very high quality, and some of them are kind of what not to do. But we can provide examples of focus prompts. The key component to a focus prompt, though, is to construct, from our point of view, what we often call a desired outcomes workshop or session, where we spend quite a bit of time working with the organization or group to make sure that they have had the opportunity to articulate what this is supposed to do for them that they have not yet done, what this is supposed to allow them to produce or implement or evaluate, so that they can then be confident that they're going to be able to use it.
One sort of final question here is some of the people at CECAN, Martha Bickett and Peter Barbrook Johnson and Alex Penn and others have been working in participatory system mapping, and obviously there are, as one of the questions asked here also is about, using social network analysis. What would you say in your mind, and I was even thinking about it myself as I was listening to the presentation, what do you see as the main advantage of your take or your way of doing things, say, versus these others? And then even maybe to push it, do you think they can work in conjunction with each other?
The first one is that we've kind of refined the methodology so that it's very clean and has and is accessible to organizations, so that it is not a complicated process to do. It relies really strongly on the capacity to quantitate on qualitative information and produce something that is workable for the organization. So it's both, you know, highly rigorous and also useful. So that's a plus from my point of view. Around participatory system mapping, we you know, have some experience with that. Of course, we see that as a different level, and similarly with social network analysis, there are two things that I am a huge fan of. And one is conducting group concept mapping. And while you are thinking about group concept mapping, not normally at the same time, because as I mentioned before, group concept mapping is also a community formative tool, if you want to look at it that way. The participation itself helps to form conscious communities. Conducting social network analysis after a group concept map is done is one of my favorite things to do, because it's so clear now that we have a description of commonalities that make sense to us, and we can then work on the realities of a social network analysis to see how that will inform action, capacity development, evaluation, and so on. Similarly, we also often suggest and work with our folks to conduct environmental scans, which allow us then to say, if these are the priorities in a particular context, what already exists? What are the best practices around this? What are the quality issues around what already exists? How accessible are these things? And how sustainable, so that we then create an environmental scan that allows the decision makers to start with a set of knowledge that they didn't have before. And it's targeted to what was described on the map.
Oh, fantastic. I think that's the end of the Q&A. I'll turn it over to you, Lisa.
Brian, there were a couple of questions in the Q&A box. I think we've still got time to raise them.
Oh,
They're
I missed
pretty
a couple of those
succinct.
too. Sorry.
Can you see those?
I am looking now. I'm not seeing the additional ones. I thought I moved through most of them, but.
I can see them from where I am.
Oh, here we go. Yes. Okay. I've got it.
Okay.
Yeah. So, sorry. So, well, okay. So you can see them now, Mary. So one was, how are the results from the GCM incorporated into an organization that is hierarchical?
That is such a good question. Typically, and this is one of the reasons why we have not really worked much in the corporate sector, because of the structure that is typically imposed in decision making, but that's changing a lot. And a key component for incorporating both the practice, the event itself of group concept mapping, and the results is to engage individuals at all levels. So creating a champion, making sure that you have a champion at an appropriate level in an organization, even if it's hierarchical, to talk about, to say, here's another way for us to create a strategy that doesn't exist yet. A key component with doing any of this work, and I'm sure that you're all aware of this, is to speak to the need of the individual and the organization, as opposed to telling them how cool the stuff that you do is. Because they don't really care how cool things are. They don't really care that group wisdom is kind of a groundbreaking technology. What they want to know is how what you're going to do is going to move them from where they are now to where they need to be to create something that doesn't exist yet that they want. And so that would exist in any environment, but a really good question, Mike.
And then there's one last question here. Is it okay, Lisa, we do one more?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, real quick. So, and this goes, this is a great question because it's something I was wondering about too. And it goes back to this question of your approach versus others. This individual quotes an article by Grove and Meal,
Yeah.
which gave account on the number of papers which found that an algorithmic approach outperformed an intuitive qualitative approach at a ratio of about 128:8. How do you think that affects your approach?
I'm not sure what outperformed means, because it really, one has to think about what the purpose of the analysis is and what the data going in is. And so, you know, I will look at this because I don't know this. I'll have to look at this and see. But I think it's a really useful caution. If it's important for people to think about the number of papers, yeah, I'm struggling with the concept of outperforming because I just don't know what that means in this context or what it means in any of the papers that were reviewed. So that would be really interesting to look at, and I promise I will do so, Lawrence. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary and Brian. That brings us to the end of our webinar today. As I mentioned earlier, we will be adding the recordings and the slides to our CECAN website, and you should receive an email confirming when they are available. Thank you all for attending, and thanks again, Mary and Brian, for hosting today's webinar. I hope everybody has a good afternoon. And finally, there is a final plug. We have another CECAN webinar scheduled on the 1st of October, and that will be presented by Dr. Toby Lowe from the University of Newcastle. And the title of his webinar is How Learning Support Systems Approach Can Be Used in Managing Complexity. If you're interested in attending, please go to our website and follow the instructions to register. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Bye.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thanks.
Thank you,
Bye.
Brian.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Bye now.